Interesting. So for you, you would say most of your athletic experience, at least outside of school, has been like more sport and performance kind of stuff as opposed to lifting.
Yeah, yeah. So lifting's been more of an accessory to like more of a conditioning thing to everything that I've
Right.
been doing in training. So um, hence why for I wasn't until I retired I could squat twice my bench because we didn't bench press and I've got a bunged shoulder. So yeah, a lot of it's around conditioning side and athlete performance.
Do you think that's the norm
Yeah.
in biomechanics research? Because I know that that's the same for exercise science. Like most of it is geared towards like sports and athletics as opposed to just strict like hypertrophy, which there's not really very much of a field for direct hypertrophy research, obviously. But
Yeah, I definitely agree on that front. In terms of if we're looking into the sports side of biomechanics, because a lot of people also go into clinical side. In the sports side, a lot of it is based around athlete performance over hypertrophy. But I know a lot of my students are quite interested in the hypertrophy side. So I can definitely see some stuff growing into there, especially with it coming out more on TikTok.
yeah,
We've actually been introduced the lab, I think it was last year, around biomechanics in the training side, like explaining why a back squat is more glutes and why front squat's more quads based on the moment arms sort of thing. So at the moment, not much, but it is growing.
so before we get started, what do you want people to know about you?
So a bit of my background, I'm a little bit different to a lot of people out on TikTok at the moment. So my area comes more from athlete performance side over bodybuilding in terms of what I do outside of TikTok. So I used to race BMX for quite a while and then retired and started moving a little bit more into the lifting space. But at the moment, I masters in exercise science research and I'm moving on to a PhD as well next year. So a lot of my background comes in from more what I've learned around in the academia side. Yeah.
Do you lift currently for hypertrophy or not really? Like just for overall conditioning?
Yeah, a bit of both. So yeah, that's one of the differences I feel is I do lift a bit more on hypertrophy side now than I used to because it used to be specifically for sports performance.
Right.
But part of it, an internal reason for me a little bit is enjoyment in the gym and keeping active since I'm not training 6 days a week. So a lot of it is train, squat, bench, and deadlift, and then a lot of kind of hypertrophy accessories around that as well. So it's a lot of different things.
Now, would you say you're training bench squat and deadlift just for the sake of it, just because you enjoy doing it, or because there's some type of programming nuance there that made you choose that over just using like hypertrophy style isolation exercises for everything?
A little bit of both, actually. So part of the reason is that I enjoy it, but another reason is it's the training style, I believe, is more similar to how I used to. So cycling with fatigue peaking at certain months when I had to compete. And it was more of a carryover from what I was already doing. So yeah, a little bit of both in that sense.
How would you say? Because I was meaning to ask Dr. Craig about this when I get him on the
Mm.
podcast, because I know he worked with soccer players. But obviously, there
Yeah.
is a big disparity in the way that we would train for just strict hypertrophy and for athletic performance. But there is somewhat of overlap and a crossover, and it seems to be context dependent based on what sport you're trying to play. So specifically for something like cycling, what do you think the equilibrium is between hypertrophy training and also separate kind of either athletic or just coordination training? And how does it differ from just a strict bodybuilder's program?
So I'd say a bit of the similarities, I would say in terms of how we target musculature.
Mm.
So when we're training in terms of athletes, we're really thinking about movement patterns, but also what muscles are involved.
Right.
And when we manage fatigue within sessions, it is somewhat similar to hypertrophy training as well. But I think in terms of the athlete side, I think fatigue becomes a bit more important in that sense. But I think some of the differences I would also say is sometimes what lifts we do tend to go more compounds and isolations because a lot of it is focused around partly the movement. So a little bit more on the neurological side as well as the hypertrophy side. But in saying that, I think the neurological side is also important if we're thinking about hypertrophy as well. So there's, yeah, a few crossovers, but then some differences, yeah.
So let's actually lead me to wonder, like, what's your take on the argument that people make in regards to neurological adaptations that they're so hyper specific that you really would get the most efficient neurological adaptations by just practicing your sport and doing some type of imitation of a different movement pattern in the gym might not be the most efficient way to go about making those adaptations. What's your take on that from actual research?
Yeah, I disagree in that sort of sense because we are not even just the movement patterns are different, but the loads are also different as well. So a squat is very similar to, say, in BMX when we're trying to do a manual, which is pretty much a wheelie, or we're pushing through anything. The movement patterns are similar, but the loads are quite different. So you end up, while you're squatting, you are training the actual muscular side, but in terms of the neurological adaptations, you will get that from lifting, where they're a little bit different when you're actually doing the sport. And you do see a lot of strength gains, not just in the gym, but also in riding. You can definitely notice the difference between conditioning.
That makes a lot of sense. It just, in my head, it seems like there definitely should be like a logical extreme to that, where maybe you get so specific with your exercise selection in trying to mimic some type of athletic movement where it may not be as efficient. So where do you draw that line between like picking an exercise that like mimics some type of athletic movement, like you were saying with BMX and a squat pattern, versus like some people doing like, I don't know, like maybe some type of weird, like the kettlebell kind of warrior movements that you see on TikTok? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. There is definitely a line to draw in that sense, because the purpose of the gym isn't to practice the movement, which I think is where a lot of people are on the side of you should practice the sport more than the conditioning in the gym. You want the movement to be similar enough that the appropriate musculature is being used. But when you're going over hyper-specific, you're not actually focusing on that conditioning side of things. You're not putting your body under that sort of stress that you need in terms of the muscular and neurological adaptations that you're aiming for. Yeah.
And now you were talking about fatigue as well, and I was wondering also, because obviously fatigue is going to be much more important to consider as a factor for someone like an athlete compared to just a bodybuilder. And I would say it's more similar to like the dichotomy of powerlifting to bodybuilding, where like fatigue matters much more as a powerlifter in consideration compared to for hypertrophy. And I would say that's just taken to even more of an extreme with athletes. So when you're trying to make these nervous system adaptations, and you're doing these sets of squats or whatever to mimic your kind of athletic movements, are you working in lower rep ranges or are you working in higher rep ranges, or both?
Mostly in the lower rep ranges, specifically for if I'm doing stuff for power specific movements or strength specific movements, generally in the lower rep ranges, usually 3 to 5. However, one thing where that kind of goes around is work capacity. So when you're in more sprinting and above sports that more than 20 seconds, you actually sometimes want to be putting yourself under fatigue and higher volumes in order to be able to handle that sort of stress and adapt to that sort of stress. So every now and then through phases would go through more volume phases, and like I'd say it's not even that high volume, but 5 to 10 at a really high RPE to actually kind of get yourself in that condition to be able to repeat this movement many, many times.
Yeah, I don't think people realize how minimal the increase in volume has to be in order to increase your work capacity, like relative to what it was at if you were doing extremely low rep range before. Like people think you have to do such a 20, 25, 30 like myo reps. And it's just, But I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of that is that increasing your work capacity in higher rep ranges really would only benefit you in higher rep ranges and in lower load, like lower effort situations. Is that true or not really?
There's an aspect to that is true. So there's a rule of specificity. What you train is where your adaptations are going to really go towards. But the one thing that is more anecdotal that I did notice is shortly after I retired and when I was going into the gym a lot, where my work capacity was still relatively high, I noticed training sort of in those ranges and that severe amount did kind of reduce a bit of interset fatigue. Like I could squat and deadlift in the same session fine. Couldn't do that nowadays.
Yeah.
But back then, like a year ago or the start of the year, I was still able to comfortably do both at quite a high RPE and feel comfortable with it. So there is a little bit of crossover, and it kind of comes to the idea of skill transfer that we look at it a bit in motor learning. And I believe that in terms of physiology side, there is some transfer there. Is essentially practicing a skill can improve another skill, or it could decondition the other skill. Right. Depending on the similarities there. So if they're close enough, then you could,
So I don't want to get too deep into that, but what would you say, like if you just had to think, like what are the factors that determine whether or not it actually makes you better at that skill or slightly less efficient at the skill? Because we see that.
So I'm not too sure exactly what factors would play into that. A part of it is, I think, how closely related. So if we're thinking on a motor control side, sometimes it's movement goals. So for example, if you were hitting a ball or throwing the ball into one target, and you practice that a lot of the time, you'll be better when you move the target. But if you change kind of the movement pattern to more, if you're throwing it backhand, then you may not see that skill transfer. So in terms of physiology side, or when we're thinking about conditioning, I do believe part of it may actually come down to those fatigue mechanisms, in the sense if we're thinking about work capacity and volume. If the fatigue mechanisms are similar, then we can condition ourselves in that sort of sense.
So let's get a little bit deeper into those fatigue mechanisms because I'm sure
Yeah.
that the audience would love to learn a little bit more about that. So if you want to give us just a quick rundown on the major fatigue mechanisms and their differentiation from each other before I get into some questions I have.
Yeah, so the main fatigue mechanisms that we're looking at in terms of musculature, there's central fatigue, which occurs around in the motor cortex, and there's peripheral fatigue that occurs closer to the musculature. And so these are both kind of individually dependent. When we've done these tasks quite a lot, we actually see different results depending on the person, sometimes depending on the musculature as well. So essentially, what we tend to see in say surface EMG is two things. One of them is activation. So the magnitude activation that represents essentially the sum of the motor units that are being activated. So a higher amplitude represents more motor units being activated. And then another thing is frequency, which is generally a more reliable measure of fatigue, where it's essentially the firing rate, and we call it rate coding. And it's that rate at which those motor units are being recruited. And what that, if I can get my words right, what that essentially would mean is that these sarcomeres are open for longer. So amplitude, we've got more sarcomeres on, and then rate coding that on for a longer period of time.
So what are some of the things that EMG doesn't measure?
Yeah, so this is one of the big things. So it also depends on which measure of EMG we use. So the most common at the moment is surface EMG because it's the easiest to use, which is what I most commonly use. So EMG will measure essentially the amplitude of activation in that specific site, but what it won't measure is anything below that site. So it'll primarily be peripheral, and then as soon as you start going more deep, then that kind of electrical simulation is kind of lost from the motor units.
So I guess that leads me to wonder is like what do like EMG amplitude and frequency changes really tell us about activation when frequency can drop for both central and peripheral reasons, and we're not exactly sure what is what.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting thing is that it kind of depends on what's happening beforehand. So when we see a higher EMG amplitude, that doesn't necessarily always mean that there's fatigue going on because loads can increase and muscle force requirements can increase. So because EMG is only really measuring the outcome, central and peripheral kind of lead into it. So what we generally say when we're quite limited is that we measure the output force produced. So what we tend to kind of assume is if the output force drops, but the amplitude stays the same or is relative to force is greater, then it's likely more peripheral fatigue. If the EMG drops either with force or below force, then that's usually more central fatigue. And that's kind of what we're assuming, but there's also a lot more that goes on behind the scenes of the musculature that doesn't account for.
And is that mainly what you use when you're using surface EMG, or does that apply to almost all methods of EMG?
Yeah, so that's one of the main things. So when a similar thing happens when we're looking at fine wire, and which is essentially when you shove a needle into someone. It's pretty invasive. We don't tend to use it unless we're really looking at deep musculature. And same thing applies also for high density surface EMG, which is essentially a sheet of little electrodes that pick up individual motor unit activation. So a lot of the stuff I talked about kind of goes for all EMG measures because they're measuring at the level of the motor unit. To actually determine the differences between them, we need to essentially electrically stimulate before the motor unit. So one of the things, what we can see is either reduction in amplitude, and we don't necessarily know if that's peripheral or if that's central. So what we do is we stimulate earlier on, so down shortly before the neuromuscular junction, and then if we can replicate that same force output when we stimulate there, then that indicates there was central fatigue. But if we don't replicate that, that means there's muscular fatigue, because essentially what we do by stimulating there is we cut out all the central commands and everything central coming from there, so all the fatigue and the limitations, because we're sending the signal from further down.
So how strong of a conclusion could you really come to based off of just purely that? And obviously there are limitations to that because it seems like that's much more of an invasive process than something like surface EMG.
Yeah, exactly. We can kind of get an idea of what's happening in general, but it is quite invasive, so it does make it a little bit harder when we're trying to be super task specific as well, like say very specific movement patterns or specific lifts, rep ranges. The more invasive something is, the less we're able to apply it in its specific context.
And when you're doing these EMG studies, I can only assume that they're done with like lower loads in higher rep ranges because most EMG studies are done like in that fashion. Like you're not really doing many maximal effort kind of EMG activation studies, right?
Yeah, there's I've had a look at some studies and quite a few of them are higher rep ranges or to failure. I think the bigger problem why there's not many on the lower rep ranges is probably ethics. Because ethics is very picky about things, and when you're at close to maximal loads and low rep ranges, there's a higher risk of injury.
Hmm.
But I have seen a few looking at, there was one study in specific that was looking at a 3 RM versus a 15 RM, both in their failure, and they measured the rate coding and the amplitude across both. And what I believe they found is that the amplitude during the 15 rep range actually exceeded the 3 RM. But what we could see is a decline throughout the set in rate coding as well. So there's only a very handful of studies that are looking things like that. Most of them are at least like 8 reps to 15.
So could that have any implications as far as stimulating reps are concerned?
Yes, yeah. That is a big thing. So the 5 stimulating reps, in my opinion, may not always apply. And that depends on how we consider something to be stimulating. If we're only going off activation, what that study showed is EMG plateaued, I think, about halfway through the 15 RM, so about 7 or 8 reps. And then after that, it kind of just, nothing was really different to each other. So we could consider that 8 stimulating reps, right? So it really depends, and also depends on the musculature as well, because that relationship between where EMG would plateau and the decline of rate coding is also dependent on the muscle size and usually where it's located in the body. When we're thinking about larger, more proximal muscles, so say the chest, for example, the closer into the body you go, generally the bigger the muscles are, because of something I can't remember the actual name for it. Proximal distal sequencing. When we're doing movements, we actually want more force to be generated proximally, and then as we go more distal, that becomes more fine motor control. So when we think about the muscles, the chest generally has larger motor units, some more type 2 fibers, whereas we go further down, triceps have more type 1. So when we've got larger motor units, the body actually is more reliant on recruitment than it is in rate coding. So recruitment tends to plateau. I can't remember if it's earlier or later. I believe it's earlier, and then rate coding tends to increase if we're talking about this against load. But if we're looking at more distal muscles that have less motor units, then those motor units kind of get recruited a lot quicker and lower loads. And so the body has to rely more on rate coding to modulate any force production after that. So when we're thinking about peripheral and central fatigue, those could actually have implications based on potentially when amplitude may plateau.
I've never once considered that, but that makes so much sense. Like logically, that like that's just like it's just like think about like the
Yeah.
fingers or something. That's just probably the most fine-tuned muscles that we have are the finger
Yes.
flexors. Yeah, and those probably would
Yeah.
be the prime. So you would argue, based on this logic, that muscles that are more distal would probably have more or less stimulating reps.
Well, it potentially may have a little bit less if the recruitment, actually, no, probably more, sorry, because recruitment in theory would plateau quicker. I can't remember. I'll have to look at my plots. My memory doesn't do me well. But potentially the stimulating reps could change. And in my opinion, it'll actually be bigger. I will actually bring up we had a lecture slide on this recently looking at the differences in rate coding, and I will pull it up just to make sure I'm 100% confident in what I say.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was saying is that in more distal muscles, recruitment plateaus usually a bit earlier. So we could potentially say, based on recruitment alone, that more stimulating reps would occur. And then rate coding also increases a little bit earlier. So, and then in more proximal muscles, so say the chest, for example, or the glutes, the recruitment tends to plateau a little bit later,
So when you
just
say,
because the amount of motor units available.
sorry, when you were mentioning that more proximal muscles tend to be larger, you were referring to cross-sectional area, right? Not volume.
Yeah, so usually cross-sectional area and the number of motor units
So
that are available.
are we actually coming full circle as a community? And is it possibly true that smaller muscles like the biceps and the triceps actually benefit from higher volume, or is that too crazy to say?
No, that is something I have been thinking about recently. Maybe the bro lifters might have been right
Oh my.
in that sense, as potentially purely theoretically based. Then yeah, small muscles might benefit from slightly different rep ranges than more proximal muscles. Yeah.
What more evidence do you think we would need in order to have a more like strong conclusion on that? And what would have to change in the
Well,
research?
Well, I think in terms of when we want to look at activation, I think we need a bit more studies looking at where EMG plateaus for more proximal distal muscles across maybe more isolation movements. So, say if we did pec flies for lower rep ranges and high rep ranges, and then the same thing for like a tricep extension or even then a forearm curl as we go more and more distal. But then all of this gets lost when we start thinking about more hypertrophy side, because we're only looking at one potential aspect. And the problem a lot of people have with the outcome studies of hypertrophy is the measurements is quite difficult. And there's limitations to everything. So if we think more on a mechanistic side, then I think it'll just be simply more studies looking at how this changes specifically in fatigue and in rep sense.
But it seems like you're saying there might just be a ceiling to hypertrophy research in general, just due to the nature of it.
Yeah, that's the thing with the current tools that are being used and that are easily available. I'm not super familiar in that sense, but yeah, there's sort of a limit, like in terms of how well they're performed as well as the measurements. So sometimes measurements are quite good, but the problem is it's very difficult to run a study for more than say 8 weeks, because there's a lot of prep that goes into it, and there's a lot of control that would have to have around their training and diet and that sort of sense, to actually get the study going on for longer. So a lot of it, people tend to do untrained lifters for 8 weeks because we'll most likely see gains in untrained lifters for a short period of time compared to more trained lifters.
Yeah.
And just the ethics and the actual prep side and funding is quite difficult for things that are quite long duration.
I mean, obviously it makes perfect sense, and if I had thought about it probably for more than 10 seconds, I would have came to this conclusion, but I would have never thought that politics played such a role into like how much effective research we're able to get done. But yeah, it's crazy to think that ethics play a huge, like, so that is the major reason why we do studies on majority untrained lifters for such a short amount of time, just because it is actually just hard to get human beings into a place like that for a long period of time doing the exact same thing under the exact same conditions.
Yeah, definitely. Participant recruitment is actually really difficult. A lot of my friends are trying to get participants. It can take them a while. So yeah, trying to actually get people in that space to do a study for a long period of time is quite difficult. And also there's this gauge of, if they were doing it for free, it's going to be a lot harder for them to actually want to do it. So usually we give compensation, but it's not like we can give them, enough compensation for that to be the reason they do the study.
Yeah.
So getting people to actually want to do it, they've actually got to be interested in the study itself, rather than just like, oh, hey, come do it. Yeah.
And in order to give somebody enough compensation to even do the study, you need to have funding for that study, I would assume, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But
yeah, that comes a big thing. Yeah.
Would you say that the demand for stuff like that has changed because of social media, like from higher ups in, like, I don't even know where you would look for that funding. So like, from your perspective, like, you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Yeah. So at the moment, a lot of the hype is usually around the younger upcoming researchers. And I have seen more researchers, like professors and stuff, talk about it over social media. So I think over time, then it may become more and more sort of available in terms of funding. But I think bodybuilding in itself, I think the desire for there would also need to increase, right? Because a lot of it sometimes is in the interest of others. So when, because sport and conditioning and that stuff sort of higher, we're a little less worried about that stimulus side.
Yep.
So when there's more external demand, there'll be more funding. Yeah. Right. So as bodybuilding grows and grows, then I think more funding will be available in that sense. Yeah.
And it's interesting because bodybuilding, I would already say, has grown to such a huge extent already. But it's interesting, like, would you say steroids also play a role in the amount of research that hypertrophy gets? Because I would say the most popular form of bodybuilding involves anabolics, and research doesn't necessarily involve anabolics.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I definitely do believe it'll essentially reduce that sample size that we could use if steroids are becoming more and more common.
Yeah.
Because there's no way, unless it's specific to steroid use, we wouldn't do any research on them as well if we're trying to see what effective training is. Yeah, I agree.
So I want to dive a little bit deeper into muscle architecture as well, if you don't mind. So beyond just like determining force production capacity, how significantly do factors like pennation angle, fascicle length, and tendon compliance influence a muscle's specific fatigue profile and its response to different training stimulus?
So I would say that it does have a fair amount of an effect. I can only kind of hypothesize.
Right.
But if we think about it a bit, so a muscle with a larger pennation angle undergoes a shorter contraction velocity. So I potentially may reduce it. And in terms of neural fatigue, I'm not entirely sure. Metabolic fatigue, yes. So this is one of the discussions that I kind of had around in terms of what Chris Beardsley's been saying about in neuromechanical matching, and saying that force velocity, length tension relationship doesn't matter because it uses up, there's a high metabolic cost. But if we look at the optimal fascicle length, because more cross bridges can be formed, we do see an increase in metabolic cost, but we're actually more metabolically efficient as well. So in terms of the neural side, I'm not too sure how much. I doubt that had a minimal effect, because essentially a lot of stuff that happens in muscle architecture occurs after the level of the motor unit. But fiber type distribution, though, that would significantly play a role. I think that's probably the biggest role that would play on fatigue is the fiber type. So more type 1 fibers, the muscle will take much longer to fatigue, for example, compared to more type 2s.
So I want to go a little bit deeper onto Beardsley's thoughts on the length tension relationship, because that is one thing that really confuses me about his stance on neuromechanical matching, and I'm just unable to make the connection that he's trying to make with the length tension relationship. So is there any way you can maybe clear that up for me, just personally, because I just find it hard to understand?
Yeah, that when I saw what he said, it kind of grinded my gears because it was a pretty blatant misunderstanding. So his argument as to why we just flat out shouldn't consider it was two things. One thing is that if we train a muscle, when it's lengthened, then it's saying it'll undergo sarcomatogenesis, and then he's saying, oh, the length tension relationship will always end up shifting to that point, which isn't necessarily true. And it's only seen to potentially happen in some muscles. But the other problem with that is he's also been saying about metabolic cost. So one of his arguments is saying, as I said before, that at the plateau region there's high metabolic cost, but compared to the ascending is actually the complete worst for metabolic efficiency. And the descending is also pretty bad, because what ends up happening is the body will still try to recruit try form cross bridges, but they actually get inhibited, or they're not at a good length, so the actual force production for what the ATP being used is actually quite low. And then what else is he said a lot of weird things. So he's basically just been trying to use weird little aspects to try and deny its importance.
Right.
And weirdly, it's all based around this idea of efficiency, which does fall apart for many, many reasons. The body isn't always that efficient. It's designed to be efficient, but it's not always that efficient. So when we're thinking about kind of the length tension relationship, if we thought about it from a pure efficient side, it would be more efficient to recruit muscles, even with worse leverage, if they can produce more force in the length tension relationship. Simply because for the amount of neural signal you get more force, and for the same of metabolic costs, you also get more force. But what he's been trying to do is take on the extreme ends and say, oh, this doesn't matter because of this law and this law, which isn't really that well proven in literature.
Yeah. So,
whereas actually, yeah.
No, you can continue what you're saying.
I was just going to say I have seen a couple of studies that have shown that if we apply peak force where a muscle is in that optimal path of length tension relationship, it can actually get activated more. And that's part of the reason is because it has a better force producing capability.
The biggest example of that, I feel like in the literature, might be the glutes, right? Because that's what it's making me think of, at least. Because at least in all the outcome literature that we have, or at least the ones that I've seen, it seems like the glutes don't necessarily respond better to the shortened position, even though they have optimal leverage in a fully extended hip.
Pretty much. Around the hip itself, you've got essentially no moment arm. In terms of around the hip joint, you've just got a moment arm around the glutes. So that is relatively consistent throughout, but then if it's growing more, essentially, when the glutes are a bit shortened, in my opinion, that would potentially suggest, I haven't been able to find any length tension relationship data on the fascicle length of the glutes, but it may suggest that when you're at that more contracted position, you may be seeing more tendon fiber forces as well. So you can aim for your peak load to be at your peak force generating capacity.
Right. But even passing through that more lengthened position might be better than just simply staying in a fully contracted position for the thrust, is what you're arguing?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's another thing that also confused me with Beardsley is I don't know, we spoke about this in DMs. Like I sent a comment on one of Beardsley's TikToks about pennation angle.
Yeah.
And I was asking about how as a muscle's pennation angle increases, it's like force transmission from the fiber to the tendon has to be reduced just due to the cosine effect of pennation. And he replied to my comment and said, if that's true, then why don't we see a reduction in force output with pennated muscles? And I feel like that's not true. Like I feel like that we just do. And
so with an increase in pennation angle, we actually kind of, it's weird. So when the fibers kind of come in this way, that's less direct to the tendon. But the benefit of that is a slow contraction velocity. And based on the force velocity relationship, the amount of force that can actually produce is greater as well. So I can't remember off the top of my head, but there has been quite a few discussions about the benefits of changing pennation angle in terms of strength, but also power output as well. And also kind of this optimal, based on that cosine relationship you're talking about, some optimal kind of pennation angle where we could get a lot of force in the trade-off of contraction velocity as well. But that in itself also does matter, because you could have two muscles. If we're measuring the leverage of a muscle at the tendon, which I believe is, if we're looking at a whole muscle, that's realistically where we should be measuring it. The two different, I'm trying to remember what I was actually going to say. If we have one muscle with greater pennation angle, one muscle with smaller pennation angle, those force dynamics completely change. And they could have the exact same tendon properties, the exact same leverage, and the same size even, but just based on that change in pennation angle, that can change force outputs, but power output. So potentially that can also alter EMG depending on the application we're trying to use. So certain muscles are better for generating power, and we're trying to move at high velocities. Potentially, if the CNS is super optimal, that muscle may be recruited a bit more than one with a lower pennation angle. Yeah, so it does actually play an effect,
and that
especially in its power output.
And it seems to be like exactly the gap that we're missing in the research is what would affirm this hypothesis. You know what I'm saying? Like the maximal effort kind of research, because that's where it seems like that idea of internal moment arm lengths would start to break down. Because not inherently because the muscle is pennated, but just because through afferent feedback, the body, the central nervous system, must have some sort of idea that it may be able to generate higher force, even for a slightly worse metabolic cost. It may elect to do that, even if it isn't the most efficient, just for task dependency reasons.
Yes, exactly, and that's one of the big things to bring up. We've got in our muscles, we've got muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs, and together they can act as proprioceptors, so kind of where we are in space, and also one of the big things is the load experience and the muscle length. So the body actually knows a fair amount about muscles' force-producing capabilities, but also the load that occurs on it as well. So as we were saying about task dependencies, if we're thinking in the most kind of optimal force production sense, then our recruitment strategies can change. So one thing to think about, if we're in a more endurance space and we're going and moving for longer, then we would prioritize more metabolic efficiency. But if we're in a more maximal sense, where the amount of recruitment that we can send is somewhat limited, I don't believe it's as limited as people say it is, but there is some set limit to it, then we may care a little bit more about recruitment efficiency. But all of that stuff actually, in my opinion, applies more to trained lifters than it does to untrained. The reason being, all this optimal stuff comes from essentially the more autonomous stages of motor learning. So when you first start doing movement patterns, you're not super efficient. So your body is essentially trying to learn how we get from point A to point B as kind of as efficiently, but as smoothly as we can. So then as you start kind of learning movement patterns and going through the motion more, then your body actually tends to reduce the amount of different muscles like antagonists and even some synergists, the activation to fine-tune that movement, make it smoother and a bit more efficient. And that's where I think we can see a lot of the learned differences that we do see in some studies between trained lifters, as you do see a preference for learned synergies and learned movements.
Right, because correct me if I'm wrong, when motor learning happens, because as we were talking, it is ultra specific. If I were to say like practice a row, and I were rowing in this way where that my arm were to stay fully in the sagittal plane, and I were to keep my elbow tucked tight to my body the entire time, as I progress and do that row over time, my body is naturally going to put me in that position because I have practiced it. And if I were to do a maximal effort row, it's likely that if I were trying to generate maximal force, I'm just going to naturally go into the position which I practice the most. Does that make sense? Or
yes, yeah, definitely, 100% agreeing. We see it a lot in athletes as well, and I've seen a lot in myself as well. Right. The movement you practice when you're going increasing load, as long as your form doesn't break down to, compensate for something weak, you're going to be seeing pretty much the same movement and then same synergies across muscles.
So I wonder, could that neural efficiency kind of like become a double-edged sword in the sense that like if the nervous system learns to accomplish the same task with less neural drive, could that actually reduce like the long-term growth stimulus?
I mean, yeah, potentially, yeah. If we're super, super efficient at things, right, we may be recruiting muscles less as well. So potentially that could have some impact, especially if we think about the role of antagonists in movements. So if we're not so learned in the tasks, then we do tend to see more co-contraction. So sometimes the amplitude of the agonist is the same, but because of perturbations in the joints, we recruit antagonists to make that joint stiffer. So if you one analogy that Alex gave, which I thought was a great analogy, was if you're doing a perturbation task, we hold your hand out and someone starts whacking it on both sides, you don't move this way to resist it necessarily, especially if they're on both sides, you actually just stiffen your arm. So you get knocked less. The same thing happens when you're doing squat patterns, compounding, anything where any bit of stability is concerned. That's what your muscles end up doing. But that tends to become less as you learn the movement because you're a little bit more movement efficient, you're more confident. So because we've got that sort of co-contraction earlier on and that high agonist activation, we could see similar kind of growth stimulus or even higher earlier on because we actually have to fight against the agonist, the antagonist that's acting. So
Wow.
yeah, the stimulus during activation side could differ on how well we learn the movement.
That has a lot of implications for Beardsley's philosophy as well, though, because he claims that there really isn't another reason. There really isn't much of a reason to take an exercise out of your program or to include any type of exercise variation. Because he would argue that if you picked an exercise that allows you to recruit maximal motor units, then you should just stay with that exercise until it be. Actually, he doesn't really have any reason to switch an exercise out of his program. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, if you switch exercises, then it breaks down what he's saying.
Yeah. So it would, in order to, in order to stay consistent with his philosophy, he kind of has to have that opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. So one of the last things I wanted to touch on was passive tension. I know we talked about that a little bit. There's a lot of discussion about its role in hypertrophy, especially stretch-mediated hypertrophy. So, what's the current scientific consensus on the generation of passive tension? And is it purely just a result of structural elements like tightening connective tissue, or is there always an underlying component of active tension required? Because I know in animal studies, especially ones that Beardsley cites, we can't fully equate that to human models. So.
Yeah, exactly. And as similar as we all are, there are some kind of differences, especially in our musculature. So passive tension is a lot from connective tissue tightening. So essentially when a lot of people treat it like a rubber band as the muscle lengthens, it has elastic properties, but that also is the same for things like tendons as well. So one thing that does get a bit dismissed, I've noticed, is that tendons play a massive role in the passive tension generation. So for example, when we measure the Young's modulus, which is a stress strain in, I think it was a rectus femoris, was actually quite high. However, the rec fan doesn't actually really reach that descending pathway very much. So a lot of it kind of comes into its more distal end contribution into the same tendon. So when we're thinking about passive tension, there's kind of a difference in its effect in the eccentric and the concentric. So in the concentric is primarily from longer muscle lengths. But in a lot of the animal studies around psychomegenesis is during the eccentric movement, because there is some suggestion around an increase in passive tension during the eccentric. However, that's kind of been, I've noticed, has been very exaggerated, where it has come to people, and quite popular people, saying, oh yeah, the passive tension is unique to the eccentric. The problem with that is passive tension, by definition, isn't actually controlled by any neural drive. That is a structural property of musculature. So if we think about actually having to control the eccentric, we actually do need a level of neural input. Yeah, so there must be active tension in there. And I've had this discussion with quite a few people, is that we do see active myosin cross bridges occurring in the eccentric. And coming from a physics point of view, what essentially ends up happening is that force that's generated by the actin myosin is usually lower than the external forces pulling essentially it apart, until we get to that end of the eccentric phase where we've actually got to slow down our ascent. We actually have to be producing more force because we're, in that sense, decelerating. So a lot of people actually ignore the role of active tension that occurs in the eccentric phase. And I'm not going to say it's more important than the concentric, but when we're thinking about psychomegenesis and passive tension, it isn't just an eccentric thing. It also occurs in your concentric. And the reason for that is one of the big things about if we increase the number of muscle fibers in series, what ends up happening is the length of the individual sarcomeres can decrease. So what that does is actually shifts the length-tension relationship over a little bit, widens it a little bit, and it allows us to produce more force at those longer lengths. Because again, it comes to the rule of specificity. If your body is going, okay, we're consistently under load under the stretch position, we have to adapt to it.
Right.
So yeah, there's a bit of a difference when we're thinking that in the eccentric.
And that, once again, is another thing that can cloud up neuromechanical matching, because as the length tension relationship
Yeah,
of a muscle changes, now where it produces the highest amount of internal force changes. So, yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
So,
yeah. The whole NN thinks that muscles are perfect force actuators, and they're really not. No predictive model is actually ever going to be good at this.
right.
We actually have some that are used, and we don't use them at all
And
because we all know that kind of stuff.
it's
Yeah,
so important to note what you were talking about, how like just the simple fact that the eccentric was controlled means that there must have been some type of force generated in the opposite direction in order for
yes,
the
yeah,
velocity of the weight dropping to be slowed. Like that's just simple. Like logically, that must make
yes,
sense. And also, we know that just
100%.
because fewer motor units are recruited on the eccentric, it doesn't mean that motor units, first of all, aren't recruited. And we have evidence to suggest that the motor units that are recruited are actually experiencing more tension per fiber. Is that true or not really?
Yes, yeah. So that it is a double-edged sword a little bit because based on the force-velocity relationship, if you look at the eccentric, the forces it can generate is actually higher. So yeah, even though we may be recruiting less motor units, potentially those muscle fibers can actually produce more force as well. So it's a little bit of a give and take when we're thinking about a hypertrophy stimulus, which is more important. Is more tension important or more fibers being recruited more important?
Right. And if we are
So
talking about
yeah,
like pure maximization of anabolic signaling, which is literally what this niche is about, if we were to take two
yeah,
people doing the exact same exercise, exact same number of repetitions, exact same set length, right? One of which is slowing their eccentrics maybe 1-2 seconds, and the other one is having a complete full free fall on their eccentric. There is, it's undeniable that the person who is controlling their eccentric has higher active tension, higher mechanical tension being produced, albeit very little, maybe. You know what I mean? Like just
yeah, yeah,
yeah. It's
yeah,
just I don't like when because I see these type of posts all the time on social media. Like, the eccentric doesn't
mm,
matter for hypertrophy, or there's only passive tension only happens on the eccentric.
yeah, yeah.
Concentric is active tension, eccentric is passive tension.
Yeah, that's made me drop my phone a few times when I saw that.
Because it's just
I thought,
like
no.
we forget about what the words active and passive mean and what they imply.
Yeah,
The reason why we have the two definitions. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think also, I mean, obviously, this has a lot of implications for sarcomerogenesis too. And this is one thing that I've kind of been thinking about a lot recently. I have the biggest issue I have with understanding Beardsley's philosophy is actually his stance on sarcomerogenesis. And I feel like he has set so
Mhm.
many influencers on this path as far as stretch-mediated hypertrophy is concerned, where they make all this content suggesting that static stretching is all you need to maximize your stretch-mediated hypertrophy gains. And I find it very hard to reconcile with that viewpoint because the only evidence that's being cited is
Yeah.
animal studies for that. And in those animal studies that are being cited, the amount of passive stretch that would be needed to stimulate like sarcomerogenesis would be hours upon hours a week equivalent in humans.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. That's one of the things to think about when looking at animals. They're much smaller,
Yeah.
right? So some things get amplified when we bring that to humans. I actually had a similar discussion about that with my supervisor um, and one of my friends who's doing his PhD that we gym together. And they were actually reading that it was a meta-analysis. I haven't read it myself, but they were saying that muscle length don't actually change with static stretching. So I'm not entirely sure if they're referring to muscle length in terms of the length of the muscle itself or the individual sarcomeres. But if it's the sarcomeres, then there's actually a lot less evidence that static stretching alone is going to change that. And I think what they conclude from that study that the increase in mobility was actually quite a large, I think it was a neurological adaptation on that side, which, yeah, I genuinely don't really believe that static stretching is all you need in terms of that, because that doesn't explain changes in force characteristics of musculature.
So do you think that the
Because you
additional
actually want
factor
less passage.
exactly? So do you think that the additional factor might
Yeah.
be active tension that is required at least in humans? Because I mean, we've seen in cadavers. I mean, not cadaver. Is cadaver the word you would use for an animal as well, or no?
Yeah, I mean, I still say
Yeah.
that is.
So in an animal cadaver, right, we see that sarcomerogenesis happens after long amounts of passive stretching. But do we know that pure passive tension could be enough to stimulate stretch-mediated hypertrophy in humans, or is all of the evidence that we've seen suggest that active tension is at least involved? Maybe not a direct.
Yeah, I think I get what you mean. I think potentially active tension could be involved. I mean, I haven't looked too much into that specific area, but if we think about if we're trying to generate force at longer lengths, if sarcomerogenesis is occurring because we want to produce more force at longer lengths, then potentially that active tension that's generated where the cross bridges are being inhibited, that itself might induce a bit of sarcomerogenesis, potentially, only if that goal is to change force characteristics, because we know the length tension relationship is trainable in that sense. However, I have seen some studies where hyperplasia of actual muscle fibers hasn't been prominent, but I'm not entirely sure if that's more in series. I think that's probably more in parallel than in a series. So potentially, active tension could also play a role. Um, And it entirely depends on why sarcomerogenesis occurs in the first place, like
Right.
what the reason is. And yeah, so just looking at the force characteristics and potentially active tension may play a role in that.
So was Dr. Mike actually right that we don't actually know what
Uh,
stimulates stretch-mediated hypertrophy?
I mean, yeah, we know to an extent, but we don't know everything,
Right.
right? And I think that's the big thing that a lot of people miss at the moment is we know as much as we know. So a lot of people will take things in a box and say, yeah, this is what happens, but we're missing the things that we don't know. We never say a lot of things with 100% certainty. And that's what a lot of researchers, if you read pretty much any paper, they will talk about either limitations of the study or they will always talk about future work because there's always more to know. And I think your talk said once, oh, physiology is messy when defending neuromechanical matching. And maybe in this sense, I would say he was wrong about that sense, but in this sense, maybe he's right, is that because there's a lot of factors that can play into these little things, we may not know absolutely everything yet.
So that's so interesting because a theory that I've kind of been developing as far as stretch mediated hypertrophy is concerned is that it's possible that maybe like something like a yielding isometric in like a lengthened position might be more beneficial to actually trigger those adaptations than just simply static stretching. And I was curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, potentially. If you're, because static stretching and isometrics, I feel like, and that sense, the difference is we're actually really trying to produce force at that point. And that would make sense in the sense is we're really trying to get the body used to being able to generate force in that more lengthened position. That would make more sense for the length tension relationship to shift in that way, where we have more sarcomeres in series and it can produce more force later on. So potentially that might be more effective, and that would actually be something quite interesting to look at, is essentially whether we have stretching with no load and stretching with load, what ends up happening to the muscle fibers in that sense. Yeah.
I would love to be a participant in that study. How do I sign up to become a participant? Cool. I would love to add to the pool,
So a lot of it, you'll tend to advertise it a lot. So sometimes you see it on social media, sometimes it's through connections, or there's flyers all around the university in my department based on random different studies that happen. I think most of the ones I participated in have been through word of mouth, but in terms of more official academic research outside of like a master's or a PhD, and depending on the sampling method used, usually you'd be able to find it online or you get contacted. You may even potentially be able to contact universities and say, hey, if you're doing any studies around this side and you need participants, then you could get snatched up for something, especially if they've got a master's, honors, a PhD student who's looking into bodybuilding kind of research, then yeah, they would contact you. Yeah.
I need to do that, honestly.
Yeah, honestly.
I really, because I feel like that would give me so much experience as well. Like just getting an idea, being a participant would give me so much of a better like scope on how the equipment works and how the measurements are being taken.
Yeah.
And that's really what I need the most is that like practical real world application.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the one big thing that I've noticed when it comes to TikTok and what I'm doing for work.
Yeah.
Is a lot of people will talk about methodologies without ever touching them, and especially happens a lot with surface EMG and crosstalk as well. So a lot of people will disregard some studies and just be like, oh, that's probably just crosstalk. But the level of crosstalk is also very dependent on the electrodes used as well. So generally smaller electrodes, less crosstalk, and we also spend so much time filtering EMG. Really, really heavy filtering because it's in my opinion, it's horrible to work with.
EMG
it's so interesting. I hate it. I hate it. We're doing some projects with students at the moment. So many of them pick EMG, and we look at each other going, "Why? The stuff sucks." It's so annoying to work with. It's interesting, but it's pain to work with.
Even like the at-home EMG kits and stuff like that are difficult to work with, like the ones that you see people taking to the gym, like like the Betterfly guy.
Oh yeah. I think those tend to have. Hopefully, I haven't used them, but I have maybe a bit of pipeline to do some of the analysis side easier. But there's also a lot of tedious stuff that goes into skin preparation as well, which becomes quite annoying. So I've been a participant in my friend's study who uses similar ones to the at-home ones, but they're wireless EMG sensors. And for those, you've got to shave yourself for them frequently, and then to actually get any good readings, which I think some people may lose at the at-home ones, is you've got to shave and prep the skin properly with gel. So funny thing is we used to use alcohol and sandpaper, and turns out we only found this recently that causes worse skin impedance than not doing anything because it dries the skin out. Yeah,
it was so weird. Idea to do that.
Yeah, I don't even know. They just went, oh yeah, it must be really clean if we sand all the skin off and then just put alcohol in it. But then the skin gets dry, there's no moisture, and the electrical signal doesn't come through. So yeah, those at-home ones those also, you got to make sure that you're prepping them properly and also putting them in the correct bit of the musculature as well, because they tend to be, depending on the lecturer side, probably more prone to crosstalk as well. And then you've got to check what's happening on the analysis side, whether the data's filtered or not. So because when we get an EMG signal, it polarizes and depolarizes. So we've got this big wave that comes across. That usually gets offsetted because of noise that comes in through the cable. And if you're doing it wirelessly, it can come through the wireless signal, come through the electrodes. So that's got to be filtered out. And we've also got to make sure sampling's high enough. We've also end up just filtering it real smooth, like crazy as well. That misses some of those peaks. So there's so many tedious things that go into after you get the data as well. It just becomes a lot of work to use.
Yeah, it seems like it would be very hard to replicate
Yeah.
that just in a gym with your at-home tester. At least if you were able to replicate it, it would be very
Yeah.
hard
Yeah.
to make it as accurate and with all the variables as controlled as in a research context.
Yeah, exactly. And there's one guy out there, I forget, I think Mr. EMG,
Oh,
I think
Rowan
does a lot of
EMG?
really good. Yeah, Rowan EMG. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, yeah, he does quite a good job at comparing exercise as well. And he's at the end of every video, he's always saying like, yeah, this is one participant, you know, and there's always those little limitations, but I think that's where the use of those wireless and then iPad connected EMGs become actually really cool because of that ease of use as well. And when you're comparing those sort of conditions, those could end up, the issues that you come with that you're going to be really tedious about could end up being okay as long as the differences are quite large. But they definitely do have their use. They're really cool. I would actually wouldn't mind a pair.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I feel like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
at least to test it out. Like I wonder if I'd be able to
Hmm.
get like a good quality education on how to use equipment from just starting with like an at-home EMG kit.
Yeah, so if you've got the equipment, then you can play around with it as
Yeah.
well. And then on top of that, a lot of what's taught about equipment usually comes from textbooks. That some of them are quite complex, but they do teach quite well what things to look out for as well. And usually keep with more up-to-date ones because as new equipment comes, they change. And usually as equipment becomes more commercial, they tend to have more recommendations on how to use them appropriately. But actually physically using them gives you a lot of information on, what am I getting out of this? What does it mean? How do I use it properly?
Yeah,
Yeah, more than just reading a textbook.
yeah, and literally like how much do I value this information that I'm getting from this reading? Like to what degree
Yeah,
should this be considered? I think that's the most important part, implication of using this stuff.
mm, yeah, 100%. Especially especially EMG as well. I feel a bit more than other measurements we use. We've got to be very careful about it. So, like if you're comparing two different exercises, it's very important for things to be volume equated or intensity and volume equated, or perception of effort equated, because you can just get more amplitude simply from it just being a bit harder as well. And we've also got to make sure that EMG is normalized well. So I think it was the LAT study that was brought up about where they put on, I think it was EMG sensors on L1s through to L6 as well, and they were talking about biasing the LATs and found no difference. One of the weird things on the study is how they did their normalization. So if you put EMG sensors on your pecs and then your triceps, because the motor units in the pecs are a bit larger, you tend to get a higher amplitude. So the maximal amplitude you get from a maximal effort in the pecs would be higher than, say, the triceps. So what we do is we do an MVC and we push against something really, really hard as we can. And that's set as our standard as well. And when they did it with that study, they were looking at segmental differences, but then did an MVC movement for all of the regions as well, which is weird because, you're doing an MVC assuming that there are no differences when you're trying to find differences.
Is this a study that Yo
So,
Talks
yeah.
went on Google Slides with and made like a table in like Google Slides with of the EMG
Yes.
readings? Oh no.
Yeah. Yeah, it was that study. Yeah, that was a hard read to watch. That's one of the things that comes to me as someone who's done research and written papers, as well, is when you're looking and reading things, when you looking at trends, it's not really the best way. Like there's a reason we have statistically significant differences, right? So that's why when I looked at that video and responded and plotted the standard deviations as well, and everything just kind of flattened out and overlapped. And then all of a sudden your data is meaningless. You go from seeing a trend to everything just being the same. Yeah.
So what do you think? One of the biggest like questions that this is making me want to ask is like, what do you think the first thing that we need in order to drive some harder conclusions in hypertrophy? Like from a coach's perspective, what's the most important thing that I need to find that we don't have yet in this research that with the addition of you think would increase the value of the knowledge that we have currently?
In my opinion, it would be better performed outcome studies, which I know is quite difficult. The thing is, there's some disconnect between the mechanisms and what actually happens, because we can have the mechanisms as laid down as we want, but hypertrophy, the actual effect of things like mechanical tension and motor unit recruitment, that's effect on hypertrophy is also somewhat unknown. And part of the reason is because measuring the outcome is quite tricky, and measuring those stimuluses is quite difficult. So in my opinion, I think better outcome measurements of hypertrophy will allow us to kind of better understand and better describe those mechanisms behind it. Because if we want to know if a mechanism works in this context, we also need to pair it with the outcome as well. So we need to be able to see if more motor units being recruited will more hypertrophy. We need to be able to see more mechanical tension, increase hypertrophy, but also any other potential factor that may lie outside of those two things that some have been discussed as well. And I think one discussed at one point is actually the sliding across two joints, across the muscles and the extracellular matrix. That is stress may apply. So all of that we can determine with better measures of hypertrophy.
So before we wrap up, I know we wanted to talk about one other thing, which was alternative models to neuromechanical matching. Um, so
Yeah,
so Beardsley famously says that you don't really have a right to criticize his model unless you're able to come up with a better model. So I wanted to know what your
yeah.
thoughts on the models that we have currently available and how accurate that claim from him is.
Yeah. There's two reasons why that's stupid. It's one, it's a logic fallacy. Two, he is wrong because we actually do have other models, but they're not as simplified as neuromechanical matching. So what there's been a bit of work in musculoskeletal modeling, is essentially where we get kinematic and kinetic data, so movement data and external force data, and we put those into models with skeletons and with muscles. And one thing we want to depict is muscle activation and muscle forces. And if we don't have EMG readily available, there have been some optimization approaches to kind of determine what that activation is. So there's quite a few ones that exist, and they essentially have different costs, so different goals. So some are neural efficiency, metabolic efficiency. I think another one I've seen is minimizing shear forces. And the problem is, and I've had a lecturer who despises these models, and I never use them, and most people never use them, is that they don't actually get task dependencies correct. So the goal of the movement. So, and the same thing will apply with neuromechanical matching, is that whether we want to minimize shear forces, whether we want to minimize metabolic efficiency, we can do the exact same movement with similar loads, but your brain may have different goals. So one thing in particular it does miss is activation of antagonists. If we think about neuromechanical matching and neural efficiency side, it's not efficient at all to activate antagonists, right? So that's one thing that alternative models and NM tend to miss, and there was also a study on it where they completely missed antagonist activation because of its role in stability. But in my opinion, if we want to use a model for training aspects, I think the science-based lifter has talked about this as well. I mean, had a few discussions around it, is that maybe instead of relying on muscle leverages, because activation is messy, we don't know that too much, but we do know and do have evidence and some other models that consider, especially the musculoskeletal models, they use a hill-type muscle model. So that takes in force velocity, length tension characteristics, and also sometimes tendon characteristics. And using things like that and thinking about the muscle dynamics can actually inform our training a little bit better. So if we're focusing on training muscles where they can produce more force, they're likely actually going to potentially be activated more, but we also know that they will go under more mechanical tension as well. So, for example, the rec fin, if we're lying back in a seated leg extension, what that does is lengthens out the rec fin, and it actually produces more force at those larger lengths. And there has been a study actually showing more growth doing that than if we lean forward, and same growth in the vast thigh muscles. So if we base our training around the rec fin, if we base it around the muscle architecture and the length tension relationship, we not only see more activation, but we see more growth. The thing with the rec fin is that it's really, really good at more lengthened positions. So the one thing with a leg extension is that the resistance profile is hardest at the top. And that may be a little bit better for the vast thigh muscles, because I think their length tension relationship is a little bit more towards a slightly flexed position. I can't remember exactly what it is.
I want to say it's the outer one. I want to say
But
it's the vastus lateralis.
lateralis and medialis. Yeah, I think the intermedius has a similar relationship with the recfen as well. It's only from one study I've read. So yeah, maybe if we swap the resistance profile where it mimics kind of like a squat pattern, potentially we may see more recfen growth, and it would be interesting to see how that may change vastus growth as well.
That, so that's very because I have a prime leg extension. So when I do leg extensions, I always just naturally have it on the more like lengthened to mid position anyway. I find it very
Yeah.
difficult to train leg extensions in the shortened position anyway. There's so much like isn't there the highest amount of shear forces on your knee when you're in that fully extended knee anyway?
Oh, yes, yeah. That would, because if you've got the femur and the tibia here, those forces are going straight down, so that would cause a little bit more sliding. But also, when you're more lengthened, when more passive tension is generated around the tendon, that can actually help keep the knee in place. So even though those muscles are also responsible for the stability within a joint, like that's why you have the rotator cuff and why you have the scapula is to prevent your shoulder, humerus just popping out. So yeah, I would actually agree in that sense.
Well, I mean, this has been an amazing conversation, man. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for coming in. I feel like I've learned
No,
so
thank you
much.
so much for having me.
Like my audience is gonna have a lot to walk away with. If you want, do you want to drop your socials for anybody that wants to follow you if they don't know you already?
Definitely, yeah. My username is Biomech by Ollie. I go into Biomechanics Centre on TikTok, and I try to post relatively in-depth videos once or twice a week.
All right. Thank you so much again, man. I hope you guys learned
Thank
something
you.
valuable from this episode. I'll see you guys in the next one.
Yeah.